Hey there, campers! Welcome to the first virtual campfire story of the summer. Over the next 7 weeks, I will be reading you 6 stories. Just keep in mind that there won't be a story released on the 4th of July. These stories will be funny, serious, gentle, and/or spooky. I'm Librarian Lily, and I will be your narrator. Now, I promise to stop yammering and get to the good stuff. Let's begin! Today's story is A Sunrise on the Veld by Doris Lessing from her collection African Stories. Every night that winter, he said aloud into the dark of the pillow, 4:30, 4:30, till he felt his brain had gripped the words and held them fast. Then he fell asleep at once, as if a shutter had fallen, and lay with his face turned to the clock so that he could see it first thing when he woke up. It was 4:30 to the minute every morning. Triumphantly pressing down the alarm knob of the clock, which the dark half of his mind had outwitted, remaining vigilant all night and counting the hours as he lay relaxed in sleep, he huddled down for the last warm moment under the clothes, playing with the idea of lying abed for this once only. But he played with it for the fun of knowing that it was a weakness he could defeat without effort. Just as he set the alarm each night for the delight of the moment when he woke and stretched his limbs, feeling the muscles tighten and thought, even my brain, even that, I can control every part of myself. Luxury of warm, rested body, with the arms and legs and fingers waiting like soldiers for a word of command. Joy of knowing that the precious hours were given to sleep voluntarily, for he had once stayed awake 3 nights running to prove that he could, and then worked all day, refusing even to admit that he was tired. And now sleep seemed to him a servant to be commanded and refused. The boy stretched his frame full length, touching the wall at his head with his hands, and the bedfoot with his toes. Then he sprang out like a fish leaping from water, and it was cold, cold. He always dressed rapidly, so as to try and conserve his night warmth till the sun rose 2 hours later. But by the time he had on his clothes, his hands were numbed, and he could scarcely hold on his shoes. These he could not put on for fear of waking his parents, who never came to know how early he rose. As soon as he stepped over the lintel, the flesh of his soles contracted on the chilled earth, and his legs began to ache with cold. It was night. The stars were glittering, the trees standing black and still. He looked for signs of day, for the graying of the edge of a stone, or a lightening in the sky where the sun would rise, but there was nothing yet. Alert as an animal, he crept past the dangerous window, standing poised with his hand on the sill for one proudly fastidious moment, looking in at the stuffy blackness of the room where his parents lay. Feeling for the grass edge of the path with his toes, he reached another window further along the wall, where his gun had been set in readiness the night before. The steel was icy, and numbed fingers slipped along it, so that he had to hold it in the crook of his arm for safety. Then he tiptoed to the room where the dogs slept, and was fearful that they might have been tempted to go before him. But they were waiting, their haunches crouched in reluctance at the cold, but ears and swinging tails greeting the gun ecstatically. His warning undertone kept them secret and silent till the house was 100 yards back. Then they bolted off into the bush, yelping excitedly. The boy imagined his parents turning in their beds and muttering, "Those dogs again," before they were dragged back in sleep, and he smiled scornfully. He always looked back over his shoulder at the house before he passed a wall of trees that shut it from sight. It looked so low and small, crouching there under a tall and brilliant sky. Then he turned his back on it, and on the frowsting sleepers, and forgot them. He would have to hurry. Before the light grew strong, he must be 4 miles away, and already a tint of green stood in the hollow of a leaf, and the air smelled of morning, and the stars were dimming. He slung the shoes over his shoulder, Veld schoen that were crinkled and hard with the dews of 100 mornings. They would be necessary when the ground became too hot to bear. Now he felt the chilled dust pushed up between his toes, and he let the muscles of his feet spread and settle into the shapes of the earth. And he thought, I could walk 100 miles on feet like these. I could walk all day and never tire. He was walking swiftly through the dark tunnel of foliage that in daytime was a road. The dogs were invisibly ranging the lower travelways of the bush, and he heard them panting. Sometimes he felt a cold muzzle on his leg before they were off again, scouting for a trail to follow. They were not trained, but free-running companions of the hunt, who often tired of the long stalk before the final shots, and went off on their own pleasure. Soon, he could see them, small and wild-looking in a wild, strange light, now that the bush stood trembling on the verge of color, waiting for the sun to paint earth and grass afresh. The grass stood to his shoulders, and the trees were showering a faint, silvery rain. He was soaked. His whole body was clenched in a steady shiver. Once he bent to the road that was newly scored with animal trails, and regretfully straightened, reminding himself that the pleasure of tracking must wait till another day. He began to run along the edge of a field, noting jerkily how it was filmed over with fresh spiderweb, so that the long reaches of great black clods seemed netted in glistening gray. He was using the steady lope he had learned by watching the natives, the run that is a dropping of the weight of the body from one foot to the next in a slow, balancing movement that never tires nor shortens the breath, and he felt the blood pulsing down his legs and along his arms, and the exaltation and pride of body mounted in him till he was shutting his teeth hard against a violent desire to shout his triumph. Soon, he had left the cultivated part of the farm. Behind him, the bush was low and black. In front was a long vley, acres of long, pale grass that sent back a hollowing gleam of light to a satiny sky. Near him, thick swaths of grass were bent with the weight of water, and diamond drops sparkled on each frond. The first bird woke at his feet, and at once a flock of them sprang into the air, calling shrilly that day had come. And suddenly, behind him, the bush woke into song, and he could hear the guinea fowl calling far ahead of him. That meant that they would now be sailing down from their trees into thick grass, and it was for them that he had come. He was too late. But he did not mind. He forgot he had come to shoot. He set his legs wide and balanced from foot to foot and swung his gun up and down in both hands horizontally, in a kind of improvised exercise, and let his head sink back till it was pillowed in his neck muscles, and watched how above him small, rosy clouds floated in a lake of gold. Suddenly it all rose in him. It was unbearable. He leapt up into the air, shouting and yelling wild, unrecognizable noises. Then he began to run, not carefully as he had before, but madly, like a wild thing. He was clean crazy, yelling mad with the joy of living and superfluity of youth. He rushed down the vley under a tumult of crimson and gold, all while the birds of the world sang about him. He ran in great, leaping strides and shouted as he ran, feeling his body rise into the crisp, rushing air and fall back surely onto sure feet, and thought briefly, not believing that such a thing could happen to him, that he could break his ankle any moment in this thick, tangled grass. He cleared bushes like a diker, leapt over rocks, and finally came to a dead stop at a place where the ground fell abruptly away below him to the river. It had been a 2-mile-long dash through waist-high growth, and he was breathing hoarsely and could no longer sing. But he poised on a rock and looked around at stretches of water that gleamed through stooping trees, and thought suddenly, "I'm 15. 15!" The words came new to him, so that he kept repeating them wonderingly, with swelling excitement, and he felt the years of his life with his hands, as if he were counting marbles, each one hard and separate and compact, each one a wonderful shining thing. That was what he was. 15 years of this rich soil, and this slow-moving water, and air that smelt like a challenge, whether it was warm and sultry at noon, or as brisk as cold water like it was now. There was nothing he couldn't do. Nothing. A vision came to him as he stood there, like when a child hears the word eternity and tries to understand it, and time takes possession of the mind. He felt his life ahead of him as a great and wonderful thing, something that was his, and he said aloud, with the blood rising to his head, "All the great men of the world have been as I am now, and there is nothing I can't become, nothing I can't do. There is no country in the world I cannot make part of myself, if I choose. I contain the world. I can make of it what I want. If I choose, I can change everything that is going to happen. It depends on me, and what I decide now." The urgency and the truth and the courage of what his voice was saying exalted him so that he began to sing again, at the top of his voice, and the sound went echoing down the river gorge. He stopped for the echo and sang again, stopped and shouted. "That was what he was!" he sang, if he chose, and the world had to answer him. And for minutes he stood there, shouting and singing and waiting for the lovely eddying sound of the echo, so that his own new strong thoughts came back and washed around his head, as if someone were answering him and encouraging him, till the gorge was full of soft voices clashing back and forth from rock to rock over the river, and then it seemed as if there was a new voice. He listened, puzzled, for it was not his own. Soon he was leaning forward, all his nerves alert, quite still. Somewhere close to him there was a noise that was no joyful bird, nor tinkle of falling water, nor ponderous movement of cattle. There it was again. In the deep, morning hush that held his future and his past was a sound of pain, and repeated over and over. It was a kind of shortened scream, as if someone, something, had no breath to scream. He came to himself, looked about him, and called for the dogs. They did not appear. They had gone off on their own business, and he was alone. Now he was clean sober, all the madness gone. His heart beating fast, because of that frightened screaming, he stepped carefully off the rock and went towards a belt of trees. He was moving cautiously, for not so long ago he had seen a leopard in just this spot. At the edge of the trees he stopped and peered. Holding his gun ready, he advanced, looking steadily about him, his eyes narrowed. Then, all at once, in the middle of a step, he faltered, and his face was puzzled. He shook his head impatiently, as if he doubted his own sight. There, between two trees, against a background of gaunt, black rocks, was a figure from a dream, a strange beast that was horned and drunken-legged, but like something he had never even imagined. It seemed to be ragged. It looked like a small buck that had black, ragged tufts of fur standing up irregularly all over it, with patches of raw flesh beneath. But the patches of rawness were disappearing under moving black, and came again elsewhere, and all the time the creature screamed in small, gasping screams and leaped drunkenly from side to side as if it were blind. Then the boy understood. It was a buck. He ran closer and again stood still, stopped by a new fear. Around him, the grass was whispering and alive. He looked wildly about and then down. The ground was black with ants, great, energetic ants that took no notice of him, but hurried and scurried towards the fighting shape, like glistening black water flowing through the grass. And as he drew in his breath and pity and terror seized him, the beast fell and the screaming stopped. Now he could hear nothing but one bird singing, and the sound of the rustling, whispering ants. He peered over at the writhing blackness that jerked convulsively with the jerking nerves. It grew quieter. There were small twitches from the mass that still looked vaguely like the shape of a small animal. It came into his mind that he should shoot it and end its pain, and he raised the gun. Then he lowered it again. The buck could no longer feel. Its fighting was a mechanical protest of the nerves, but it was not that which made him put down the gun. It was a swelling feeling of rage and misery and protest that expressed itself in the thought, if I had not come, it would have died like this, so why should I interfere? All over the bush things like this happen. They happen all the time. This is how life goes on, by living things dying in anguish. He gripped the gun between his knees and felt in his own limbs the myriad swarming pain of the twitching animal that could no longer feel, and set his teeth and said over and over again under his breath, I can't stop it. I can't stop it. There is nothing I can do. He was glad that the buck was unconscious, and had gone past suffering, so that he did not have to make a decision to kill it even when he was feeling with his whole body. This is what happens. This is how things work. It was right. That was what he was feeling. It was right, and nothing could alter it. The knowledge of fatality, of what has to be, had gripped him, and for the first time in his life, he was left unable to make any movement of brain or body except to say, yes, yes, that is what living is. It had entered his flesh and his bones and grown to the furthest corners of his brain, and would never leave him. And at that moment, he could not have performed the smallest action of mercy, knowing as he did, having lived on it all his life, the vast, unalterable, cruel Veld, where at any moment one might stumble over a skull or crush the skeleton of some small creature. Suffering, sick, and angry, but also grimly satisfied with his new stoicism, he stood there, leaning on his rifle, and watched the seething black mound grow smaller. At his feet now were ants trickling back with pink fragments in their mouths, and there was a fresh acid smell in his nostrils. He sternly controlled the uselessly convulsing muscles of his empty stomach and reminded himself, the ants must eat too. At the same time, he found that the tears were streaming down his face, and his clothes were soaked with the sweat of that other creature's pain. The shape had grown small. Now it looked like nothing recognizable. He did not know how long it was before he saw the blackness thin and bits of white showed through, shining in the sun. Yes, there was the sun, just up, glowing over the rocks. Why, the whole thing could not have taken longer than a few minutes. He began to swear, as if the shortness of the time was in itself unbearable, using the words he had heard his father say. He strode forward, crushing ants with each step and brushing them off his clothes, till he stood above the skeleton, which lay sprawled under a small bush. It was clean picked. It might have been lying there years, save that on the white bone were pink fragments of gristle. About the bones, ants were ebbing away, their pincers full of meat. The boy looked at them, big, black, ugly insects. A few were standing and gazing up at him with small, glittering eyes. "Go away," he said to the ants, very coldly. "I am not for you. Not just yet, at any rate. Go away." And he fancied that the ants turned and went away. He bent over the bones and touched the sockets in the skull. That was where the eyes were, he thought incredulously, remembering the liquid dark eyes of a buck. And then he bent the slim foreleg bone, swinging it horizontally in his palm. That morning, perhaps an hour ago, this small creature had been stepping proud and free through the bush, feeling the chill on its hide even as he himself had done, exhilarated by it, proudly stepping the earth, tossing its horns, frisking a pretty white tail, it had sniffed the cold morning air. Walking like kings and conquerors, it had moved through this free-held bush, where each blade of grass grew for it alone, and where the river ran pure, sparkling water for its slacking. And then, what had happened? Such a swift, sure-footed thing could surely not be trapped by a swarm of ants. The boy bent curiously to the skeleton. Then he saw that the back leg that lay uppermost and strained out in the tension of death was snapped midway in the thigh, so that broken bones jutted over each other uselessly. So that was it. Limping into the ant masses, it could not escape once it had sensed the danger. Yes, but how had the leg been broken? Had it fallen, perhaps? Impossible. A buck was too light and graceful. Had some jealous rival horned it? What could possibly have happened? Perhaps some people had thrown stones at it, as they do, trying to kill it for meat, and had broken its leg. Yes, that must be it. Even as he imagined the crowd of running, shouting people, and the flying stones and the leaping buck, another picture came into his mind. He saw himself, on any one of these bright, ringing mornings, drunk with excitement, taking a snapshot at some half-seen buck. He saw himself, with the gun lowered, wondering whether he had missed or not, and thinking, at last, that it was late, and he wanted his breakfast, and it was not worthwhile to track miles after an animal that would very likely get away from him in any case. For a moment, he would not face it. He was a small boy again, kicking sulkily at the skeleton, hanging his head, refusing to accept the responsibility. Then he straightened up and looked down at the bones with an odd expression of dismay, all the anger gone out of him. His mind went quite empty. All around him he could see trickles of ants disappearing into the grass. The whispering noise was faint and dry, like the rustling of a cast snakeskin. At last, he picked up his gun and walked homewards. He was telling himself half defiantly that he wanted his breakfast. He was telling himself that it was getting very hot, much too hot to be out roaming the bush. Really, he was tired. He walked heavily, not looking where he put his feet. When he came within sight of his home, he stopped, knitting his brows. There was something he had to think out. The death of that small animal was a thing that concerned him, and he was by no means finished with it. It lay at the back of his mind uncomfortably. Soon, the very next morning, he would get clear of everybody and go to the bush and think about it. Well, that was our story for today. Thank you so much for listening to the inaugural episode of Virtual Campfire Stories, and I hope you'll come back again. If you listened to this when it went live at 8 a.m., kudos. If you listen to it after, that's cool too. I know I like to listen to something on my morning commute, a fun story, which is why I'm offering it to you this way, but listen to it whenever it strikes your fancy. It's the magic of the internet. All of the stories for this program will be available in a playlist on our YouTube channel called Virtual Campfire Stories, so you can listen to them there, replay any of them that you like. If you're interested in reading more of Doris Lessing's work, it is available through the library. Call or place a hold today. Have a great week, a safe 4th, and I'll talk to you again in a fortnight. Bye!